First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the chance to participate in this exciting symposium, and a special thank to Robert Maxwell, who was so kind and reviewed my English. So, one of the major transformations that occurred in the field of sculpture in France during the 14th century was the rapid expansion of secular sculpture. This is especially true for public images of the king and other members of his family that Charles V had installed in strategic places, not only on religious but also on secular buildings. The Bastille Saint-Antoine, the portal of the Celestines Church, the Tour du Village and the Donjon at Vincennes, the Grand Vis at the Louvre, or the eastern entrance to the same castle are well-known examples of this ambitious visual program, so actively displayed and so well knitted together. The iconography and function of these sculpted images have been largely discussed during the last 30 years by Alain Erland Brandenburg, Jean-René Gabory, Ulrike Heinrich Schreiber, Frédéric Kleber, Uwe Benner, and Bernd Carquet, among others. The seminal role of the patronage of Philip the Fair at the beginning of the same century in serving as a model for the royal program of Charles V has also rightly been stressed by some of the same authors. So there is no reason to doubt that the expansion of the possibilities, the expansion of different audiences, and the rise in importance of statues as a tool of visual political discourse was a crucial phenomenon in the history of late medieval sculpture. This statement doesn't apply only to France, but to take into account similar developments in Austria, Bohemia, England, Italy, or Spain will be too big a subject. Scholars have, however, considered much more in detail the question of the possible goals of patrons than the problem of the reception of these sculptures by their audiences. So it may be useful to turn our attention to this subject. Many possible approaches could help us understand how these works were viewed and regarded. It would certainly be interesting, for instance, to consider if other members of the royal family followed the footsteps of Charles V, and if so, how, and if not, why. Through that angle, a comparison between John, Duke of Berry, his brother Philip the Bold, and their nephew Louis d'Orléans is quite striking. We all justly consider that sculptors at the court of Burgundy took their art to the highest possible level, and Susie Nash will remind us of this in a few moments in her paper. It is all the more intriguing that the most important sculpted images connected to the Burgundian Duke are embedded in a religious context, with a single exception, as far as I am aware of. The pastoral group once placed at the castle of Germont. John of Berry seems to follow King Charles' model much closer, in placing statues of himself, his wife, and the royal couple in the grand salle of his palace at Poitiers, on the mantelpiece of the chimney, very visible in the general view, and you see here in plaster casts. And a larger ensemble on the exterior of the adjacent Tour Maubergeon. You see the tower here, and details of two statues. These ensembles are quite similar in spirit to the Grand Vis at the Louvre. Louis d'Orléans seems to have made still different choices in placing secular statues, not of contemporary individuals, but mostly of mythical figures, the nine worthies on the walls of his castle at Pierrefonds, and of the lady worthies at La Ferté-Milon. I will not analyze in depth these discrepancies here. Suffice it to say that I suspect that this might have to do, at least in part, were the foundations of the authority of the three dukes. While Philip the Bold was building his power on bases largely independent from the king's actual control, John of Berry's power relied only on delegation from the monarch, which might have encouraged him to style himself as a close and faithful representative of royal authority. It is certainly not by chance that Jean de Montagu, a high member of the administration under Charles VI. So it's certainly not by chance that Jean de Montagu adopted a similar strategy, placing himself physically under the sign of the king. Statues of Charles VI were actually placed over the entrance of his castle at Marcoussis and on the portal of the Celestines church that Montagu founded there. It is also worth stressing that we have no trace of a similar use of sculpted images by King Charles VI, which we probably can explain through his illness first, and then through the troubled political situation of the kingdom during the second part of his reign. Be that as it may, the differences in tackling the visual heritage of Charles V should certainly be analyzed in detail to better understand the reception of the king's sculptural politics. Nonetheless, today I would like to consider this question from another viewpoint. I would like to ask if this major turn in the use of monumental sculpture left any traces in contemporary writings. This approach seemed to me promising, since there is at least one very well-known source proving that some statues commissioned by the French king were considered by the first viewers to be important statements. In her biography of Charles V, Christine de Pizan explicitly celebrates, as you can see on this slide, the statues of the royal couple that adorn then the portal of the Celestines church. And I show you an engraving of the portal published by Milan in the early 19th century. This mention seems to confirm that contemporaries responded to this type of images. However, if we check other written sources, we quickly discover that this responsiveness to the new secular images is not that common. A study of responses to sculpture in written sources in France during the late 14th and early 15th centuries is very difficult, for it is very hard to establish a corpus of texts which to build upon. There are two main reasons for these. First, potentially interesting information is scattered in a wide variety of writings, from chronicles to treatises, from letters to payments, partly due to the non-existence of a tradition of writing on art. Second, because of this state of affairs, no one, not even 19th century scholars, has tried to gather this sparse evidence. For this conference, it would not have been possible to fill this gap, for this would require a very long period of research. I decided then to concentrate on a major source for the history of this period, the Chronique du Religieux de Saint-Denis, and to complement it with less systematically gathered information from other texts. I will only briefly remind you that this chronicle covers the whole span of Charles VI's reign from 1380 to 1422. It was written by a monk of the celebrated Saint-Denis Abbey, north of Paris, who doesn't name himself, but is most probably to be identified with Michele Tomasi, cantor of the Abbey, who lived from 1350 to 1421, and actually the two last years of the reign were covered by a follower. Until the early 1410s, the author is very well informed about matters concerning Paris, the royal and papal courts, the kingdom, and its major allies or enemies. The first observation we can make is that precise references like the one we find in the biography by Christine are exceedingly rare. The Chronique du Religieux de Saint-Denis doesn't mention a single secular statue in recording 40 years of French history. We know, however, that people were sensitive to monumental sculpture delivering political statements. Let's take a telling example. In relating the visit of Emperor Charles IV to his nephew in 1378, and you see here a miniature showing a banquet given by Charles V to Charles IV. So in relating this visit, the Grand Chronique de France stressed that in decorating the famous Grand Salle of the Palais de la Cité, which you see here in an engraving of the 16th century, before the Grand Salle burned in the 17th century. So in decorating this famous Grand Salle with tapestries, the statues of French kings were carefully left visible. Statues of French kings were installed here, here, and here. And as you see, the Grand Chronique tell that the tapestries were si bien ordonnées et si à point mis que le roi qui sont de pierre tout autour n'était point occupé ni empêché de voir. Not only was it important that the emperor could admire this exceptional ensemble, but it seemed worth recording the fact that the statues remained on view. Once again, however, after a promising start, sources disappoint our expectations. When recounting the visit to the Louvre, the Grand Chronique makes no specific mention of the spectacular sculpted decoration of the palace, notably of the Grand Vice. Silences are always difficult to explain, but we may offer the hypothesis that only sculpted works with a very high memorial value were deemed worthy of mention in written sources. This is not only the case of the statues of the Grand Salle, whose decoration, as you all know, was begun under the reign of King Philip the Fair in the early 14th century. Tombs drew also the attention of visitors and writers. Once more, the Grand Chronique testified to this fact, with the explicit mention that Charles IV wanted to see les sépultures des rois, et par spécial Charles, the King Charles and the Queen Jeanne, and so forth. Christine de Pisan also mentions a few funerary monuments. That she also relates the desire of the emperor to see the royal tombs in Saint-Denis doesn't matter much, for she is evidently relying for this information on the same Grand Chronique. But it is more telling that she makes explicit reference to the riche tombe of Philip the Bold at Chaumont and to the haute tombe of Du Guesclin in Saint-Denis. Even the clerical author of the Saint-Denis Chronicle paid attention to sepulchral monuments. He even was informed about the existence of an exceptional marble and alabaster tomb that John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, had made for his wife and himself. Let's not consider here that the chronicler seems not to be especially well informed about who this wife was. In his description of Paris, which he visited in 1407, Gilbert de Metz also singles out that in Saint-Denis, I quote, sont moult de riches sépultures de rois et princes. There are many beautiful tombs of kings and princes. The text by Gilbert de Metz is interesting, for it clearly shows that secular and even funerary sculpture never received the same sustained attention as religious sculpture. The most precise description of a sculpted work by Gilbert is the chancel of Notre Dame, about which he even gives a few iconography details explicitly mentioning the scenes of the life of Joseph. You see one of these scenes, this dismantled ensemble, which is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Sacred images still remain the major focus of attention for contemporary writers. Christine mentions twice the devotional use of sculpted images. First, she describes the infant Louis d'Orléans' praying habits before a statue, and then she relates how the dying Charles V held tightly and kissed a crucifix that was presented him. For Christine, one's lifespan was thus framed by sacred images, and it is certainly fitting that the young boy used the statue of the Virgin and Child, while the king, in his last moments, meditated on the sacrifice of the Redeemer. Such devotional practices were largely shared by at least all the upper classes of society. We just have to remember that the Ménager de Paris suggests to his wife to use a belle image as a support for her devotion at the church. Michel Tomasi also mentions a few images standing in churches on altars. These sculptures are cited as objects of devotion, but also as miracle-working images. They can save a child from losing his sight, and it is worth noting that the miracle cited in the text occurs not immediately after the eyes of the child are blessed with the relics, but while the mother is praying in front of an image of the Virgin and Child. Images also come alive and punish a sacrilegious attempt to rob them. Images also announce, as you see in this example, while trying to rob a jewel from a statue of Saint John the Baptist, a man falls down and dies because the statue turns to the wall so that the robber can take the jewel. Images also announce tragedies. Images also announce tragedies, something that France wasn't sure of in those years, like here the statue turning on herself, announcing something bad. We are accustomed to miracle-working images through texts dating from the High Middle Ages, but these mentions are useful reminders that such attitudes persisted longer than we sometimes assume, even at the brilliant courts of the Valois princes. We now need to pause a moment to think about the culture of the writers we are taking into account. It is not surprising that the Benedictine monk of Saint-Denis was more prone than other witnesses to underscore the exceptional nature of religious sculpture and to talk more about sacred images than secular ones. Conversely, it comes as no surprise to read a letter in which Jean de Montreuil praises the beauty of a statue of the Virgin in Chailly by declaring her worth to be compared with the lost masterpieces by Lysippus, Praxiteles, or Apelles. Jean de Montreuil is actually well known as a major exponent of early humanism in France. However, things aren't that simple, and the intellectual position of the writer does not explain everything. First of all, it is well conceivable that the troubled political context of those days immediately affected the attitudes of writers to arts. It is quite striking that the clerical author of the Saint-Denis Chronicle gives much less space to mentions of works of art of any kind after the outbreak of civil war in France, following the murder of Louis d'Orléans. Only the General Council of the Church and the political relationships to England seem him worthy of his attention alongside the internal conflict. Otherwise, anything else, including arts, evidently loses its importance to him. Second, we have to take into account that the place writers give to an art is related to its social and cultural role in the society they live in. While only seldom talking about sculpture, Michel Pantoin pays much more attention to works of the sumptuous arts. Goldsmiths' works and tapestries are very often discussed, and even sometimes at great length, because they were prominently employed at key moments of political and social life. It is tapestries and other precious textiles were displayed at every solemn meeting between princes, and secular vessels, jewels, and other golden objects were systematically used to strengthen ties on earth or with heaven as presents or offerings for saints, kings, princes, prelates, and ambassadors. It is very telling that the clerical author of Saint-Denis, who never comments on the political significance of sculpted images, recounts at length how contemporaries responded acutely to the message of tapestries. In fact, in a beautiful passage, he relates how during a peace conference in Leuringen in 1393, tapestries showing ancient battles were chosen by the French. The Duke of Lancaster underscored, however, that the subject seemed very inappropriate for the occasion, prompting the French to replace them with tapestries showing the Passion of Christ, or relating to the Passion of Christ. In other instances, the Benedictine chronicler does pay attention to the iconography of textiles. So it is quite clear that not only his cultural profile, but also his implicit hierarchy of values determined his loquacity or silence about works of art. The most striking example of this attitude is given by a passing mention he makes to a religious sculpture. This passage is fascinating also because it seems to prove that sacred images could also be perceived as tools of political propaganda. In 1414, after a peace treaty had been signed between the Duke of Burgundy and the king, a Parisian craftsman entered the church of Saint-Eustache and striped the white stole off a statue, since he associated the ecclesiastical stole with a white scarf that served as a sign of allegiance to the Armagnac party. It is tempting to assume that the statue in the Parisian church had been provided with a scarf to manifest the submission of the Burgundians to the royal party. A member of the Parisian working class that remained largely faithful to the Duke of Burgundy could have very well interpreted the political message and symbolically expressed his dissatisfaction. The chronicler, however, only briefly comments on the event, although he mentioned the horrible punishment the man incurred. His hand was cut. A punishment that confirms the political significance of the gesture. Since I have stressed up to now the question of the reception of sculpture's messages, before concluding, I would like to turn my attention to the question of the aesthetic sensibility of French writers, if I may use these terms. Admiration for the quality of workmanship was not only expressed by intellectuals living close to the curb or belonging to humanistic circles like Christine de Pizan or Jean de Montreuil, as we had seen. In 1411, during the turmoil that shook Paris, the celebrated residence of Bicêtre, belonging to the Duke of Berry, was pillaged and burned. Michel Pantoin mentions that luckily 2 beautiful rooms were not damaged. They were sculpted marvelously in Saracen work. It is difficult to explain this definition. This Saracen work has certainly to do with the concept of étrangeté, so important to understand the taste of Valois princes. We should also remember that the Duke of Berry secured workmen from Spain to have the beautiful and rare blue and white tiles for his residences. Be that as it may, my main point is here that the Saint-Denis chronicler responds to the simple visual qualities of secular sculpture. Similarly, Gilbert de Metz praises the beauty of the portal of the Hotel of Jacques Duchier, saying that it was, I quote, entaillé de art merveilleux, end quote. It is interesting to note that Gilbert and the Benedictine monk use the same word in French or Latin to celebrate the sculpted work they talk about, muse or merveilleux. It would certainly be very interesting to analyze the lexicon used to speak about sculpture in these sources. To understand completely the choice and use of words, it would be necessary, however, to take into account all other arts and a larger amount of text than those I could examine for this paper. So I will have to stop here this brief inquiry on sculpture in French written sources around 1400. As you see, this was only a preliminary report. I hope, nonetheless, that it will be enough to show that this is a promising theme and to offer some materials and ideas for our discussions. Thank you.